Hi, welcome to Wine Country at Work. I'm Ralph DeAmicis, your tour guide. This episode is about the Silverado Trail. This is a first draft. This is about a documentary that we are doing about the Silverado Trail in the Napa Valley. And it's actually, the idea came up from a chapter in a book we're working on called Wine Country in Shorts. It's stories that we've been collecting over the last 18 years and finally writing down over the past 5. And one of the chapters is the romance of the Silverado Trail. Now, if you're not from Napa and you don't know what the Silverado Trail is, it's this road that goes up along the eastern side of the valley at the foot of the Vaca Mountains. And the Vaca Mountains are a ridge of volcanic hills that were pushed up about 3 million years ago. It's actually the drier part of the valley because it's further away from the ocean. The western side of the valley, being closer to the ocean, is much greener, and the geology is quite different. So the trees over there are much thicker. So this was always, you might say, the poorer side of the valley. Well, the actual trail goes back to before the Westerners came. This was an important trail for the native people. And it was an important commercial trail. And I always wondered, why did it travel up along this side of the valley? Now, people said, well, it was there in partly because it would go up above where the river flooded. But the river actually goes over to that side of the valley. But during the wintertime, the center of the valley does flood. So this made sense. But as I worked on this, and I've been touring the valley now for 18, coming up on 19 years now, I've gone up and down this road hundreds and hundreds of times, and I know the geology well, and I know a lot of people who live along it, and I know the history, and I realized there was a really important reason why. This valley was populated by 2 different native tribes. Close to the water was actually a bigger tribe called the Patwin, a very big tribe. They actually extended all the way over into the next valley to the east, which today would be modern Fairfield. They controlled all down by the water, and they were very well known for making sacas. Sacas were these little boats, these reed boats that they created. Up in the valley was a tribe that the Spanish called the Guapo, from the term guapo, which can mean handsome, but it can also mean fierce and dangerous. And this tribe was very insular, and they were considered to be very dangerous. And they started in what today would be modern Yountville further north, and they went all the way up into Lake County to the north. Now, the third tribe that lived in the valley were not humans. They were grizzly bears. And there were actually so many grizzly bears in the region that outside the region, in other languages, the word for grizzly bear was Napa. So these 2 tribes lived with these giant California grizzly bears, a huge number of them. Well, the grizzly bears, of course, would like down by the creeks, and they would like the more wooded hills to the west. But they would be less inclined to want to live and hunt over on the dry part of the valley. So, of course, the trail was there on the dry part of the valley so that as they traveled north and south, there was a lot less chance they were going to run into someone who might think they might make good lunch. Now, admittedly, those hillsides over there are kind of well known for mountain lions, but mountain lions are a completely different case from grizzly bears. And I think that's really one of the reasons why they chose to go down those eastern hills instead of the more heavily wooded western hills. Now, up in the valleys, and actually throughout the valleys, most of the little villages, and they were typically quite small, 100, 200 people, were close to streams. And in the Napa Valley especially, a great number of the people both dug roots and they also gathered acorns. The acorns they have are these big acorns, they can be like 1 inch to 2 inches long sometimes. They're like little torpedoes. And they would grind those up, and then they would soak them to get the tannins out and get the oxalates out, and then they would make a meal out of it that they would use as for baking bread. They would also, of course, hunt. But when they hunted, of course, they were competing with the alpha predators who were the grizzly bears. But they coexisted with them quite well, apparently. Now, The Silverado Trail was important because it ran all the way from the base of Mount St. Helena, the mountain at the top of the valley. This is about 5,000 foot tall former volcano, reformed its ways about 3 million years ago, travels all the way down along the eastern hillsides, and comes all the way down to where today, just past what is now downtown Napa. It came very close to the river. Why? Because when they got to the river, where the Napa, downtown Napa is today, the Napa River meets the Napa Creek. And yes, they have the same name, because in Napa, if they really like a name, they go with it. And the water gets deep enough and the river gets straight enough that they could negotiate with the Patwin for boats. And then in a 3-hour paddle, they would be down all the way down by the bay. And down by the bay was another tribe called the Carquina. And the Carquina meant the traders. In fact, there's a bridge there today which is called the Carquina's Bridge. And they were famous traders, and they would trade with them. Although the Wapo, well, the real name, what they called themselves, was the Onasai. It meant the outspoken ones. The Onasai would actually trade all the way as far south as what is not modern Los Angeles, and all the way as far east as Utah. Remember, Utah was the name of the tribe that lived in that region, Utah. It's kind of a similarity to Napa and Sonoma, because those were both also native people's names, native people's words, as compared to so much of California, which is Saint somebody or other. So they would travel down this trail. Well, what were they trading? Basically, they were trading efficiency and power. What do you mean, efficiency and power? They were trading tools and weapons. And what they were trading were knives, axes, arrowheads, scraping tools made from obsidian. Now, you've probably heard of this term before, obsidian. It is black volcanic glass. And what happens is, if when you get a volcano like Mount St. Helena and Mount St. John, which is right down in the valley, and Mount Sonoma and Mount Hood, when they erupted, they would send out very, very pure high silica ejecta. And it would land in water, in lakes. And when it hit it and got cooled that fast, it created this volcanic glass. They called it obsidian. And many times it's black, or sometimes it's black with a little bit of white in it, but most of the one in Napa are primarily black. And the region where it's found in Napa today is called Glass Mountain, not surprisingly. The thing about obsidian is that it is the sharpest object on the planet. So, as a result, when you use it for anything, you will get the best possible result. It's sharper than most steels. You can actually sharpen it down to one molecule across. So imagine if you've been using, chips of stones for your arrowheads, and you're shooting a bear or you're shooting a deer, but now you've got the sharpest object on the planet that you can put on the end of your arrow. Think of the difference that makes. Or if you've got a big grinding sheet, and they would take pieces of wood and embed it with obsidian chips, hundreds of obsidian chips, and you take those things and you grind it on there. Think of how much faster you could grind down, things like nuts and fruits and roots, how much faster you could grind them down. Efficiency and power. Now, it's interesting that, they would travel down, and obsidian does not exist every place. It's found in certain spots. So this is why it was so important. And they became very good artisans. Their ability to work with this was really, quite formidable. Originally, they were actually from further north, up in the lake country. And they actually moved south and pushed the Patwin out to gain control of Glass Mountain. And this, of course, was thousands of years ago, but they weren't from there originally. What's interesting is that where throughout the state of California, there's many tribes. There's 100 plus tribes, recognized tribes. There are none of the Onasai, of the Wapo, in Napa. Why? Because the Onasai never gave in. to the Spanish. They never gave in to the Americans. Why? Think of this. They're using tools made out of stone. At the time when the Spanish arrived here, this was people living in the Stone Age. They hadn't gone through bronze and iron. They were living in the Stone Age. When the Spanish arrived, they brought these metal tools, and they convinced the tribes to use these very effective metal tools. They were competition for the Onasai. The Onasai would not give in to the Spanish because they were taking away their business. And they never gave in, and it wasn't until the early part of the 20th century that the American cavalry moved the last of the Onasai out of the county to a rancheria or a reservation up along the Sonoma coast. They never gave in. Now this is the historic use going back thousands of years. When the Americans showed up, of course, immediately they put a road up the middle of the valley. It's called St. Helena Highway. Everyone knows it as Highway 29. And the Silverado Trail, they actually developed in about the 1860s as a wagon road. Why? Because the same reason why the native people used it. The valley would flood out. The middle of the valley would flood out during the torrential rains in the middle of the winter. It still floods. It's very common. Up around Oakville and such, it floods. Rutherford, it floods up in that area. It goes right through the vineyards, sometimes it goes right into the wineries. So they built this road to make it easy for them to get up and down the valley. And once you have a road, now you're going to have commerce because people want to go back and forth. And in the mid-1800s, one of the people who really wanted to develop the northern part of the valley was a man named Sam Brannan. And he had been the first postmaster in San Francisco, among other things. Well, he was a developer. And one of the things that's amazing about Calistoga is that it has hot springs. And if you've ever heard of Saratoga Springs in New York State, up north of New York City, it's a famous hot springs. And he would always say to people, this is going to be the Saratoga Springs of California. Well, he would have, prospective investors come up, and he would say to them, this place is going to be the Saratoga Springs of California. Well, he would pour an awful lot of brandy. Now, he was a Mormon, but he's what you call a Jack Mormon, and that basically a Mormon who drinks alcohol. And they would pour a lot of brandy, and they would pour a lot of wine. Well, one night he was especially, in his cups, as they used to say, and he came out and said, this is going to be the Calistoga Springs of Sarifornia. And of course, it stuck, and it became Calistoga. And because this town has a wonderful sense of humor, they have a Cafe Sarifornia. So this trail became very, very important for going back and forth. But the name was not due to that. The name actually goes back to the gold rush. Why? Because during the gold rush, in order to smelt gold, you need mercury. And during the process, mercury is added into the liquid metal, and the gold binds onto it. And once it binds onto it, then you can bring it to the surface, and then you put it in a smelter, you burn it, and the mercury has a lower melting place, and it turns into gas, it disappears, and then you have the pure gold. It's a very toxic process. Well, they discovered mercury in Napa Valley, especially up on Mount St. Helena. And this became an opportunity for the mercury miners. Now, they were a very loony group. Why? Mercury is a neurotoxin. And the guys who worked in this stuff were known to go crazy. But they would go back and forth, up and down the valley in order to mine the mercury. And they would have to transport the mercury out in big wagons with big inflated rubber tires, so it would be as gentle as possible, because otherwise it could explode. You'd like to avoid that. So it was a real process, and the name of the mine was the Silverado Mine. Now, people are confused about this because later on they discovered silver up there, so people thought, they're mining the silver, but the name precedes silver. Silverado. The common name for mercury at that time was quicksilver. It related to Mercury the god, the Roman god. So actually the road, the Silverado Trail, which comes from quicksilver, has this association to the god Mercury. which, if you know any astrology, relates very strongly to writers and to healers. Now, kind of interesting if you think about it, that this was the road that you could take up to the healing springs, right? And it also has strong associations with famous writers, because this became the place where you would go. This was the place that you would go back and forth to, to go to get your health back. And back in the mid 1800s, late 1800s, one of the most famous writers in the world at the time, though he became more famous later on, was Robert Louis Stevenson. He was from Scotland, and he was living in England, and he met a Californian woman named Fanny. And they fell in love. And Robert proposed to her. Very smart. And she said no. Why? Well, first of all, if you ever see photos of him, he looks very malnourished. He probably smoked, he probably drank too much, and he was a writer, so he never had a steady income. But despite all that, she said no. And then she hopped on a sailing ship and sailed back to California. Now, at that time, you had two options. You could either take a ship that went around the tip of South America, or you could land in Panama and walk the several miles through the torrential rains of the Panama jungle, and then board another ship on the other side. So I'm not sure what she did, but by the time she arrived there, she was skin and bones. But Robert Louis Stevenson is a poet in love. So after she leaves, he hops on another sailing ship and follows her. Takes the same route. Now, that's pretty brave. I mean, just the fact that going that long in sailing ships, these were not steamships, many of them were lost at sea in storms. It was pretty brave, not just because of the process of sailing, but also, what's to say that she hasn't gone back to California and found, like, a big, tall, strong, bronzed Californian to love? I mean, what's the chances? I mean, she's an intelligent woman, she's a nice looking woman, but he still follows her. He gets there to San Francisco, that's where she is, finds her, and she has not found a new lover. And he proposes again. Now, he's skin and bones too, so he looks worse than he did in England. And she is skin and bones, but at least she can understand. He proposes again, and this time she accepts, which is really remarkable, except for the fact that he's just traveled halfway around the world for his beloved. So she knows he's committed. So she says yes. Well, their friends say, you two just look like death warmed over. But you should go up to Napa, because Napa has these great spas, and you can go up there and get your health back. They say, oh, okay. So they go up, and they travel up to Napa, and they stay originally in St. Helena. Now, there is the town of St. Helena, and there's Mount St. Helena, which is endlessly confusing. So I tried to say Mount St. Helena or the town of St. Helena. And St. Helena was actually named for, there's 4 different stories about the name. But Helena, St. Helena, was actually the mother of the Emperor Constantine, who himself was a famous astrologer. And she was the one who convinced Constantine to make Christianity the official religion, which he never really was into it, but he basically redesigned it at that time to basically turn it into the state religion, that he could use it basically as a second government. And he already controlled people's finances and people's legal issues, but now by using the Christianity and creating the Catholic Church, he can now control people's beliefs, which is pretty powerful. So his mother convinces him to make Christianity the official religion. He dies and on his deathbed is baptized. And so St. Helena. Well, there's 4 different stories related to that, and that's actually a whole different story in the wine country in shorts. But the story you hear in Napa is that it was named by a Russian princess. Now, her name was Ilona de Gagarin, and she was a Russian princess. She lived at the Russian camp along the Sonoma coast. And Ilona is the Russian version of Helen or Helena. So, who was it really named for? But apparently it's the same. But supposedly, the story I kind of like about it is that she was a Tsarina's niece, and she was in love with a very handsome count, Ken Rostov, Alexander, a very gallant man, a great poet, a great soldier, and they were very much in love, but he was several levels below her in rank. So the Tsarina said, no, you can't marry him. No, his rank is too low. You have to find someone more at your own level. And Elena, a woman of love, married him anyway. And they had 3 children. And Alexander's financial prospects and opportunities dried up. The Tsarina was a little upset with them. Well, the next big opportunity they have, it comes several years later after 3 children, they're still quite young, is this opportunity to go to Alaska, to the sealing camps. At that time, Russia controlled Alaska, and there were famous fur camps. The fur hunters would send furs back to Russia. It was a big, big economy at that time. In the late 1800s, furs were a very big business. And so, before the times of central heating. And so they went to Alaska. Well, luckily, the Alaskan governor was having a hard time getting enough food for his people, so he sent Alexander and his wife and his 3 children on 2 ships down the coast to the Sonoma coast to start a farm where they could raise livestock and they could grow vegetables. They could also send their hunters out in American sailing ships to hunt the sea otters. The pelts were really valuable. So they spent their time that was supposed to be in the frozen wastes of Alaska living in Sonoma. And they traveled all over the area. And supposedly Helena traveled to the mountain and climbed it and put a plaque there naming it Saint Helena. And Saint Helena, was the patron saint of the Tsarina. Because remember, the Tsarina was the mother of her country. And of course, Saint Helena, who was the mother of Constantine, who made Christianity the official religion, would be her patron, her favorite gal. And you can imagine Helena writing her a letter and saying, "Dear Auntie, I've named a mountain after your favorite saint. Can I come home now, please?" And then sealing it with, a prayer and maybe a tear. That's my favorite story. There's 3 other versions. If you ever get our book, Wine Country in Short, you can see the other 3 versions, which are also equally remarkable for different reasons. So it was named after that. But when you're dealing with this, remember there's the town of St. Helena, which is about 10 miles south of Calistoga, and then the mountain of St. Helena, which is about 2 or 3 miles north of St. Helena, of downtown Calistoga. And it acts like a kind of a cork at the top of the valley, because it's 5,000 feet tall, and it's right at the top of the valley, so it protects the valley from cold winds. So it's one of the reasons why Sonoma is such a warm place. As you go up the valley, it gets warmer and warmer, and you get north of the town of St. Helena, the valley goes from a little bottleneck out wide and makes this very warm section at the top part of the valley. That's where they grow a lot of Zinfandel. So here you have Robert Louis Stevenson and Fanny Stevenson going up to Calistoga, going up to St. Helena, staying in the St. Helena Hotel, which is still there, amazingly enough, though it's not open. Well, after a week, it's expensive. It's $10 a week, and that was a lot of money for a writer and an editor. She was an editor. And so they're really stuck about where they should stay. And if someone tells them about an old miners' camp up on Mount St. Helena, you remember the Silverado mine was up there. There was an old miner's cabin, 2-story. No one's using it, so why didn't you go up there and you use it? And so they headed up the valley. And they stayed up there for 2 months. This was their honeymoon. But really, more than their honeymoon, this was their first home together. And they lived there and they traveled throughout the area. The amazing thing was they arrived with very little money. They had enough money for food, but they're not paying any rent. And he wrote a book, in fact, Robert wrote a book called The Silverado Squatters, about their time there. And how did they get around? And that's one of the very cool parts of the story, because the way people got back and forth in those days out on the West Coast was by stagecoach. If you didn't have your own horse, your own wagon, it was by stagecoach. You couldn't take the Napa River further north than downtown Napa. The river was too windy and narrow. It wasn't dependable. Once you got down to downtown, you could, take a ship. So everyone would go by stagecoach, and stagecoaches were a big thing. And the wagon masters of these things were, they called them the whips, were very important figures. They were quite glamorous. In fact, it's funny, one of the most famous ones was known as Charlie Parkhurst, and he was famous for his ability to handle the team, and to be quite daring. And it wasn't only when he died at about age 50 and they were preparing his body that they realized that it wasn't Charlie, it was Charlotte Parkhurst. The most famous wagon master for the stagecoaches was a woman. This is all during the gold rush period. But the person who helped them get up and down the valley and get to all these different places, to the Schramsberg winery, up into the petrified forest, was a wagon master, a man who ran the stagecoach line on the Silverado line. And he took a liking to this young couple and kind of helped them out. And his name was John. And he was quite tall. In those days, if you're quite tall, they called you Long John. And because he ran the Silver Line, they called him Long John Silverado. And he made it into Robert Louis Stevenson's most famous book, Treasure Island, as the name of the pirate, Long John Silver. Lookout Mountain, which is pictured in the book as well, was based upon Mount St. Helena. And so this very colorful wagon master is the person who helped them get around the valley and befriended him. And I've always wondered if he had a patch over one eye. So I think Charlotte Parkhurst did. But I don't think he had a peg leg, because that would not work on a wagon. So this is the first draft of our book, of our documentary about the Silverado Trail. Usually when we do episodes, we do one episode about a particular thing, and then we move on to the next thing. But this is such a complicated one. The trail today is so important. There's so many small, important wineries that exist along it. For instance, the Stag's Leap district has about 20 wineries there. And this was considered a backwater for years, until the Judgment of Paris in 1976, when it was a Cabernet Sauvignon from the Stag's Leap wine cellars that was one of the two wines that beat the French during the wine tasting called the Judgment of Paris. And suddenly everyone was paying attention. Everyone said, oh my God, this region, Stag's Leap, is important. You go further south, you get into the Oak Knoll district. This is an area that you seem to be able to grow everything. Some of the best Merlot in the entire valley come out of that region there. You go further north, and as you go up, you get all these really interesting zones that grow these fantastic wines. It's become a very, very important road, and it's off of the main road. It's the wineries that are off by themselves a bit. They're a little bit more remote. They're a little more private. So I hope you follow us as we go through multiple drafts as we get ready to do the main documentary. Thanks for visiting with us. I'm Ralph DeAmicis from Wine Country at Work. You should come see us in Napa. It's a gorgeous place.